all good things must come to an end. And this is the last, but not the least, event of the conference. We have two great panelists here, but to just try and put things in context. So our previous panel dealt with the post-liberal rights critiques of liberalism, and there are multiple. But one thing I think all the critiques don't understand about liberalism, they consider it burnt out, they consider it gone. I think Peter Thiel called it the ancien regime, that it's a spent force. But what they underestimate is liberalism's own capacity for self-criticism, self-reflection, and self-correction. And that's what makes liberalism different from the brittle alternatives that they are presenting, that we can, reset course. But before that's going to be the discussion we are going to have now. But I think even in the course of this conference, we've heard liberalism used in many different terms, in many different senses. It means different things to different people at different times. It means one thing in Europe, and it means another thing in America, and something completely different in other parts of the world. And in Europe, American conservatives were considered liberals because they believed in lowercase r republicanism and opposed monarchies. In the US, liberalism has been used in the classical sense as a belief in constitutionalism and a commitment to individual rights and separation of powers. But it's also been understood as progressivism to distinguish itself from traditionalism and conservatism. And one reason liberalism has so many different meanings is that it is an ever-changing, ever-changing, ever-evolving idea. Apologies.
We have so much water.
I can't open it. And at any given time, there are different conceptions of liberalism that coexist and challenge each other. And I'm saying this because our two distinguished friends over here, and they are fireside chat partners, they come from different liberal traditions, but they understand themselves as liberals. Derek Thompson is a progressive, that's fair to say, yes, who has been writing a lot about if and when progressive governance has gone wrong and what we can do to set it right. He's the co-author of the New York Times bestseller with Ezra Klein of Abundance, which is a fairly self-critical work. He's also the author of Derek Thompson newsletter, which you should all subscribe to, and he hosts the Plain English podcast, and he's a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Steven Pinker is a different kind of liberal. He's an experimental psychologist at Harvard, and he actually defies easy characterization. He's, in a sense, really old-fashioned liberal in that he believes in reason, science, and humanism. Just imagine. He has done seminal work showing how by tapping into the better angels of human nature, the Enlightenment has resulted in massive reductions in violence and delivered stability that has improved the human condition. And from this vantage point, he has criticized progressives, conservatives, and heterodox thinkers. He's a two-time Pulitzer finalist, a Humanist of the Year, a recipient of 9 honorary degrees, and his latest book is When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. So Derek and Steve will offer a critique of various shades of contemporary liberalism, especially the ones that they themselves have subscribed to, and tell us how we can renew and revitalize liberalism for the 21st century.
Thank you so much. Steve, I'm such a huge fan, and it's an enormous pleasure to be able to talk to you for the next 45 minutes to an hour. I have a very, very bold, very broad question to begin with, which is, what exactly are we defending here? What is the liberalism that you identify with? Maybe another way to ask this in a more punchy way is, what kind of a liberal are you, and what kind of a liberal aren't you?
Yeah. Yes, and it's, I think, an opposite question. A friend of mine just sat down next to me prior to the session and said, well, I've enjoyed the last day and a half, but we've heard a lot about the threats to liberalism, a lot of anguish about these threats, a number of definitions about what liberalism is not, but I haven't heard a whole lot of explanations of what liberalism is or why we should defend it. And I said, I actually haven't heard any. So I'm glad that we're going to have the opportunity to try to do that in this session. So it's, I identify liberalism as a product of the Enlightenment, which at least I characterize as the idea that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. And that if we try to do it, we can gradually succeed. That makes me a progressive in the sense that I believe in progress, although it differentiates me from a lot of capital P progressives who I find hate the idea that we've made progress, because it would seem to vindicate a lot of things that they oppose, like neoliberalism and markets. And I find some of the biggest pushback to the idea that we've made progress comes from self-identified progressives, paradoxically enough. But I don't think I'm alone. And if the idea that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing is at least my summary of the ideals of the Enlightenment. It was echoed in, and the fact that we can and have succeeded, it was echoed in Barack Obama's noteworthy statement that if you could pick a time to be born and you didn't know who you would be, which body you'd be born into, you would pick now. He made that comment in 2015. And I think it's probably still true 10 years later. So that would be a second pithy way of characterizing what liberalism is and why we ought to defend it. You probably couldn't do a whole lot better than the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson wrote, all people, I'll paraphrase or I'll update for modern sensibilities, all people are created equal. They're endowed with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments and other institutions are implemented, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That's, I think, not a bad statement of liberalism, although it has been claimed, as we just heard in the previous panel, by some of the anti-liberal movements who try to restore what they think of as the original conception of the Constitution and the Declaration. But that's that idea of equality, all people are created equal, of freedom, liberty, of human flourishing, that everyone has the right to pursue life and happiness, of government and other institutions as constructive forces to allow people to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. And the idea that governments themselves can only be justified by their ability to allow people to flourish, to pursue those aims, and that they themselves must be kept in check by the consent of the governed. I'll add another, again, I'm not enough of a soundbite engineer to suggest what the slogan for liberalism ought to be, but I'll throw out a number of ideas that I think capture it, and maybe people can adopt for the occasion whichever one seems most appropriate. But again, going back to the time of the framers, James Madison's little couplet, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, no constraints on government would be necessary. That's also not a bad summary of what animates liberalism. That is, that we have government and other institutions because we're not angels. And I would actually connect this to contemporary research from cognitive psychology and behavioral economics of the many cognitive flaws and fallacies and biases and errors that the human mind is susceptible to. I think the founders had an intuitive idea of it, as did the Greeks. But now we have good scientific evidence that people are indeed not angels. but that if we form institutions where we can make up for each other's blind spots, that even though we're very poor at noticing our own fallacies, we're somewhat better at pointing out the other guy's fallacies, so that if we have a deliberative forums in which there is freedom of speech, then we have some hope of making progress, of approaching the truth. And I'll throw out one last little apothegm or motto or slogan from someone that I think the two of us both admire, the physicist David Deutsch, who said, problems are inevitable, problems are solvable, solutions create new problems, which must be solved in their turn. And Deutsch himself was strongly influenced by Karl Popper, another, I think, great liberal theoretician, who called for an experimenting society, that just as scientific propositions ought to be falsifiable to count as scientific, and that the activity of science consists of seeing which of our beliefs withstand attempts to falsify them, that principles of governance, of social organization, should be constantly evaluated in terms of how well they work, and that we should be prepared to learn, to add to our institutions, to revise institutions. And that's what makes liberalism a little bit different than classical conservatism, which, at least by default, would tend to conserve institutions, which is not a bad idea, because there can actually be rational reasons to at least think twice about abolishing long-standing institutions that seem to have kept us in good order. But nonetheless, we should be prepared to be mistaken, that not only do circumstances change, partly because of the changes in technology, but because no one can deduce a perfectly running society from the armchair, from first principles. We should constantly assess how well things are going, take measures, revisit the institutions that seem to be flawed, and be prepared to constantly update them. So those would be principles that I think characterize liberalism, that I think are very much worth defending. And again, I would defend them by data that Shikha kindly mentioned in the introduction, and that Obama at least implicitly alluded to, that if you do try to assess how well we've been doing, there are plenty of problems, but better than we used to be. So we have been doing something right. Let's try to keep doing that, but let's also try not to repeat our mistakes, learn from our mistakes.
There's a meme going around on Twitter right now, Twitter, that bastion of liberal humanism that you've been discussing, that says, in order to have a conversation with me, I believe this is a man tweeting, you have to be conversant in Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, etc. And it's sort of like the mandatory bookshelf that one must be familiar with in order to talk to this particular anonymous tweeter. I wonder if we can do that experiment for Pinkeresque liberalism. What is the mandatory bookshelf going from, let's say, Locke to Popper and Deutsch that would make people even more intimately familiar with the strain of liberalism with which you identify? Like, who's on the liberal Pinker bookshelf? And we can contain our answers to just, 10 or so that the rest of the session isn't just naming surnames.
Well, certainly Hobbes, because he kind of identified the conditions that call for a social contract that is in a state of nature, in a state of anarchy. A war of all against all is hyperbolic, but there is a lot of violence in anarchy, and not necessarily because we are inherently bloodthirsty, that we have genes for violence, but simply because without assurance of your own security, there's always a temptation to enter into to launch a preemptive strike against your neighbors, if only out of fear that they might launch a preemptive strike against you, out of fear that you might launch a preemptive strike against them ad infinitum. That's the Hobbesian trap or Hobbesian dilemma. It actually doesn't even depend on the idea that we're innately sadistic or bloodthirsty, just that is inherent to the condition of anarchy. That by submitting to a social contract in which we surrender some of our liberty in order to protect our own liberty against the depredations of others, we can all be better off. That is, it's a solution to a social dilemma, to public goods problems, to externalities. So Hobbes, certainly Locke and Montesquieu and the other, some of the other philosophes, Hume, John Stuart Mill, for sure, for the best and still relevant defense of free speech, alluding to the fact that none of us is infallible or omniscient, kind of anticipating the cognitive judgment and decision-making literature, the Tversky and Kahneman findings on human limitations, that we're fallible and don't realize it. We all think we're infallible, but we can't all be. And therefore, free speech is the only way that we can collectively hope to acquire knowledge. Popper, the Open Society and its enemies. Spinoza, not that anyone should read the Ethics, which is a pretty dense and intimidating tome, but certainly if you're going to at least look back to who we owe modernity to. My wife, Rebecca Goldstein, wrote a book called Betraying Spinoza, the Renegade Jew Who Gave Us Modernity. And so I certainly feel obligated to name check Spinoza as a guy who gave us modernity. And I think as a modern defense of these principles, I think David Deutsch's The Beginning of Infinity is important reading.
Some of these things that you named that you consider liberal, they don't always go together. You mentioned the use of knowledge to enhance human flourishing, a value for equality, a moral democratic government that believes in legal constitution. Sometimes these things go together and sometimes they don't. Sometimes you get a character like Fritz Haber, for example, who is a brilliant scientist who fixes ammonia for the first time and allows us to develop the agriculture of the planet to feed billions of more people. But he becomes, he ultimately becomes a Nazi, but even before he becomes a Nazi in World War I, he's helping the German government develop chemical weapons to kill the French. Lots of brilliant Germans became Nazis who believe very fervently in science. Do you think, is your liberalism like a kind of like BLT, where like you need the bacon, the lettuce, and tomato to be your kind of liberal, but there are some people who have just the B, just the L, just the T, and you need the whole combination to really to actually fit your definition?
No, it's a good question, and I would sometimes when I have a few more words to add to the characterization, I say that the ideals of the Enlightenment is that we can use deploy knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing. So, as you say, knowledge can be used for any purpose, including it can develop synthetic fertilizer and it can develop poison gas. So it has to be. And just as Hume pointed out, maybe something of an exaggeration. You can't get an ought from an is. So it really depends on what your goals are. But I think that the goal of universal human flourishing as the ideal, the idea that there's nothing special about me just because I'm me and you're not, if you think deeply enough about it, if you reflect enough, you realize that the only sustainable belief system that we could share is one in which all people are equal, and therefore our goal should be to grant to others that which we claim for ourselves has to guide the application of knowledge.
You have written so much about the facts of human progress and the underappreciated, in your opinion, facts of human progress, whether you're talking about longevity, our ability to solve diseases, declining childhood mortality, poverty, pollution, violent crime. Do you consider those material facts of human progress to be like the receipt of liberalism, like the proof that liberalism can work when applied at scale?
Yeah, more or less, yes. That is, they are, I mean, not... I don't want to define liberalism circularly as everything that led to good stuff happening. But some liberal institutions like markets, which were, and by some definitions of liberalism, it's especially in Europe, It is almost equated with what in America we call libertarianism and what is sometimes pejoratively called neoliberalism. That is, that markets are generally a good way of, are the best way of generating prosperity, affluence, abundance, a topic that I assume we'll return to later in the conversation. Democracy, that surveys of happiness show that after affluence, the biggest contributor to life satisfaction is a sense of freedom. And we also know just from how people vote with their feet that they want to move to democracies. That democracy tends to correlate with many other good things in life, like safety and education and health and longevity. That this came up this morning, that the liberal international order, which is under such threat, I think does deserve credit for the reduction in war since the Second World War. Admittedly, a roller coaster, and one in which we are currently in the midst of an uptick because of Ukraine, because of Sudan, because of Gaza. But still, it's wiped out a few decades of progress, but we're still much better off than we were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, to say nothing of the two world wars. Now, there are more realist theories of the so-called long peace, that is the decline of great power and interstate war, such as nuclear deterrence. In the Better Angels of Our Nature, I reproduce arguments that the nuclear deterrence doesn't deserve all or even most of the credit, but that the liberal international world order does deserve a lot of the credit for that. Science, another at least handmaiden to the Enlightenment, if not a child of the Enlightenment, is what deserves the credit for the vast expansion of human longevity. As Stephen Johnson put it in his book, Extra Life, we no longer not only have extra life, we have an extra life, in the sense that historically, life expectancy at birth was about 30 in most times and places. Now, worldwide, it is more than 70 and more than 80 in the affluent West. So all of these good things, I think, can be attributed to Enlightenment institutions like science, democracy, and markets.
An interesting tension that I want to push on is that I think that sometimes centrist liberals, a group that I occasionally find myself aligned with, often find myself aligned with, will react negatively when progressives or people on the left are seen to complain too much about modernity, to not fully appreciate, perhaps, the progress that is made. And what I find interesting about that is that I do think that historically, it is the complainers who often help push progress forward, right? I mean, you mentioned longer lives, for example. I'm not the biggest Ralph Nader fan in the world, but there's no question that traffic fatalities are down 80, 90% because we wear seatbelts. And the reason that traffic and riding in a car is so much safer is in large part because Unsafe at Any Speed was published by Ralph Nader in the 1960s, 1970s, and it created this movement that made driving our cars safer. We have an 8-hour work week. We have much more humane working conditions, in large part because generations of extremely annoying complainers, Knights of Labor, and many other groups from the anti-monopoly movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries fought for rights that now modern liberals consider utterly necessary and utterly humane, utterly sympathetic, to use your word. How do you think about the relationship that we should have to modern progress, given on the one hand, the fact that yes, enormous gains have been made across all of these provable material fields, while at the same time recognizing that those gains are often downstream of complainers who sometimes reject the story of progress that a centrist liberal would like to tell?
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of truth to that a lot of reforms, including longevity, were advanced by critics, activists, rebels of their era, including things like implementing sewage systems and pure food and drug acts that prevented people dropping like flies from tainted milk. Traffic safety, actually, interestingly, Nader did give, in the 1960s, did give a push to that. But if you look at the curve of fatalities per passenger mile driven, it's gone pretty much continuously downward since the cars were introduced. I think Nader did give it a push, but it is something that has been advocated in different forms at different times. But so this is not to deny, in fact, this is to endorse the idea that a lot of progress has to be pushed by people who recognize problems and urge that we solve them in the face often of complacency or entrenched interests. So I think there's an important zone that reformers have to aim for in between complacency and fatalism or cynicism or outright radicalism. Namely, the system is so decadent and corrupt that we should just burn it down, and anything that comes out of the ashes is bound to be better than what we have today, which we saw in some revolutionary movements, perhaps most horrifically in Cambodia, but I think also in some of the MAGA right, which just want to demolish institutions in the mistaken belief that things have gotten so bad or so much worse than they used to be that we've got to level them and start over. So that zone between complacency and either fatalism, there's nothing we can do about it, let's just enjoy ourselves while we can because we're all going to go extinct in 30 years, or radicalism, let's burn everything down, is the zone we ought to aim for. And yes, activists and complainers make a difference.
I want to talk about the relationship between liberalism and redistribution. In many of the early philosophers that you were talking about, there was no notion of Social Security in John Stuart Mill. Thomas Jefferson was not writing about the need for Medicare and Medicaid. And yet, when we think about what liberalism means in the 21st century, these ideas, I think, are incredibly core to most modern liberals' self-identity. So how do you think about this relationship between a multi-century tradition of liberalism and a much more recent invention of the redistributional state?
Yeah, it's there isn't much in the Enlightenment about Social Security or medical care, in part because there was no medical care. It was bloodletting and
right. Yeah. Universal leeches was not exactly part of the original Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that it's as a combination of two things. The fact that I think redistribution is an unfortunate word, even though it is the reality, because it seems to prioritize equality per se as the goal, as opposed to lifting up the poor and having the people pay for it who can afford it the most. That is progressive taxation and a safety net. So the redistribution is mathematically what's happening, but it's not the goal. The goal being to prevent people from dying of inadequate medical care and food and so on. And you may as well get rich people to pay more than middle class people because they don't notice the gap or the taxes. So I think that's a case where it's a combination of recognizing problems that were suddenly deemed to be solvable, which previously were probably thought to be just intractable or acts of God. Jesus said, "The poor you will always have with you." And then it occurred to someone, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe we can do something about poverty. Together with the affluence that makes that, I don't want to say it's a luxury to help the poor and the sick and the elderly, but there's a sense in which it is, and that when there's a phenomenon called Wagner's law, that as societies become more affluent, they redistribute more. So that you start to get pensions and Social Security in countries like Brazil and India as they start to get more affluent. So it sounds kind of callous to call it a luxury, but there's a sense in which affluent countries can do that more. Mm-hmm. And they do it when people start to notice, or care about Jean Valjean being sent to prison for stealing a crust of bread, or the little match girl freezing to death, or burying Grandpa Joe by Route 66 on the way from Oklahoma to California. So it starts to, the narratives start to impinge on people's consciousness. The nuisance of artful dodgers and delinquent kids roaming the streets, or of stories of elderly people having to survive by eating dog food start to weigh on people. And governments start to take on the responsibility of seeing to those who have nothing to contribute in a market economy for which they can be compensated. That's just an inherent problem. Not everyone has something productive to offer. The very poor don't, the disabled, children, the elderly. And modern societies have figured that they should do something about it. Government is shown to be the best mechanism. And despite both the dreams of the kind of anarcho-libertarian right and the almost paranoid fears of some of the left, that the United States is or is moving toward a state with no social net, we've already got a lot of redistribution. And the OECD publishes a graph which blew my mind, of percentage of GDP that is redistributed toward the sick, the poor, the elderly, and children. And what it shows is over the course of the 20th century, starting around the 1930s, the kind of New Deal era, every OECD country shoots up from a few percentage points of GDP to about between 20 and 30% of GDP. And all affluent nations fall in that band, including the United States isn't even the stingiest. So it seems to be a fact of life that modern capitalist democracies all have a social safety net. Now, maybe they don't need to. Maybe we can envision some kind of non-existent utopia of affluence and democracy and no redistribution. It doesn't exist. Probably, can't exist. Probably shouldn't exist. Now, this might be in placing that within the overall framework with which we began the conversation. The fact that, as you note, this wasn't really a part of the original Enlightenment vision for successful societies. It might be a case of learning, of seeing if you only have markets, there are aspects of society that you want to fix, you want to change.
We were talking earlier about some of the enemies of liberal centrism on the right and on the left. And I want you to tell me if you think that this question is oversimplifying anything. But it seems to me that liberal centrism has identified enemies that they consider sort of left woke versus right woke, right? On the right, I think I look at MAGA and I look at Trump and I look at the number of extremely wealthy businessmen that support that political movement right now. And I think, aren't you the winners of liberalism?
Yeah.
And then I look at the left, and there's all sorts of surveys that suggest that the most progressive, the most far-left college students tend not to be lower class or middle class. They tend to be the children of affluent families. And so, in a way, they're also winners of liberalism. What do you make of the possibility, of the provocation, that liberalism has created conditions that have made illiberalism appealing to the winners of the system?
So does it carry the seeds of its own destruction?
Does liberalism carry the seeds of its own destruction? It's a much more parsimonious way to ask that question. Thank you.
Yeah, or as Rob Henderson put it, at least in reference to the woke left, are these luxury beliefs that, such as denigrating marriage and the police, that you can afford to have if you're in the highly educated upper middle class, but that actually lead to suffering among the lower middle class and lower class. And conversely, on the right, these billionaires who benefit from public education, stable currency, all the other
markets, financing, all these inventions of liberalism.
Yeah. So that has happened. The question is it necessary? Is it inevitable? I tend to think that most things aren't inevitable. That with a different a different set of contingent events and then perhaps a different set of different intellectual ecosystem when some of the arguments for the benefits of liberal institutions were articulated more clearly. Maybe that if we ran the timeline over, if we rewound the tape and ran it again, it may not have turned out exactly that way. So it may be a vulnerability, but I don't know if it's an inevitability.
Well, let's remove the question of is it inevitable, and replace it with the question of why did it happen, right? It happened. Why do you think it happened?
Yeah, well, I think it may be that the among the products of successful, affluent, liberal democracies, there is the luxury to have these beliefs. But it may also, I don't know what set of events set this into motion, whether, for example, the Great Recession of 2008 led to some dose of cynicism leading to some illiberalism. Yeah, I don't know. I think it would be.
Can I offer a theory and have you play around with it?
Yeah.
Again, I'm not even sure I believe this, but it's a story out there, and so this is my best effort to represent it. Ronald Engelhart has these theories of material and post-material politics, where he says that a country solves material problems, and then a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy, it rises up the pyramid. Maybe this has already been discussed today. Sorry if I'm repeating something. You rise up Maslow's hierarchy, and the most important questions to you are not where is shelter coming from, but rather who am I? Right? Questions of identity, post-material questions. And so therefore, as a society gets richer, its politics become more post-material, more cultural than economic. And I wonder if it's possible that liberalism doesn't have a very good post-material message compared to its competitors in the marketplace, right? Right nationalism is very good at saying there's good guys, there's bad guys, there's Americans, and there's other, right? And then you can imagine another kind of politics that says there's the good and the bad, there's the rich and the poor, there's the big companies and the small companies that maybe are more successful at dividing the world in two in a way that makes them more successful in the political marketplace, even if their solutions might not be as good for building long-term wealth. So another way of framing this is to say, or the provocation, I guess, back to you is something like, does liberalism have a branding problem?
Yeah.
In an age where politics is cultural now and is likely to be quite cultural going forward?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good way of putting it, that the post-material transition in affluent societies does open up the question of what will give us meaning and purpose once the wolf is no longer at the door, we have a roof over our heads, we have food on the table. Now what ought to energize our political motives. And that gap can be filled with various dubious crusades and causes, and perhaps that is a challenge for liberalism, because that question can be answered. For one thing, we're affluent, but if you care about humanity, whether you're a humanist or a Christian, maybe eliminating poverty worldwide could be a superordinate goal once your own needs have been satisfied. And it wasn't so long ago that would have been seen as romantic, idealistic, utopian. But now that extreme poverty is down to 8% of the world's population, it used to be 80%. Setting out the goal of eliminating extreme poverty. Jesus thought the poor will always be with you. Could we prove even Jesus wrong? So that could we have world peace? Again, that it's almost a satire of what the airhead finalists for Miss America wish for. On the other hand, the fact that wars have deaths in war have been going down, number of wars went down until the last few years. The idea of world peace, at least an end of interstate war, is not utopian. It's not John and Yoko, Peter, Paul, and Mary. I think it is attainable. The fact that, as Deutsch pointed out, solutions create new problems. So the solution of extreme poverty, of early death, was partly solved by capturing a lot of energy from fossil fuels, and that created an obvious new problem, namely climate change. I think there is a lot of unfortunate fatalism about climate change. I think especially in younger generations who are sometimes convinced that we are actually going to go extinct by 2050 and that it is an unsolvable problem. The idea that new sources of abundant carbon-free energy might actually mitigate climate change and give us a relatively soft landing. All of these, and as a global solution, all of these are things to aspire toward, even if we've solved the problem of where our next meal is coming from.
Yeah, I should be clear that I don't necessarily subscribe to Engelhardt personally. I mean, I think that we just had a cost of living election in 2024 to a large extent. I mean,
what
a cost of living election, an affordability election. I mean, lots of things happen in Texarkana, but one thing that happened is the price of everything went up in 2022 and 2023, and they blame the incumbents. And no incumbent democracy in the entire world essentially fared better in the 2022 to 2024 period than they did in the previous era. So I think in many cases, Engelhardt's theory can be over-applied, the idea that everything is just cultural. I think a lot of Americans just voted based on price. That said, I do think that politics is becoming more cultural over time if you look at it over like a decade-by-decade basis. And I do think liberalism has a problem here. I do think there's a bloodlessness to some of its best arguments. Like, I love David Deutsch. I loved Beginning of Infinity. One of the best ideas in that book is the idea that progress is not the end of problems, it's the replacement of one set of problems with a better set of problems. I love that idea. It's probably the worst bumper sticker I could possibly imagine for a presidential candidate. Vote for me, I will replace your problems with another set of problems, asterisk, but that set of problems will have a better distribution of outcomes than the set of problems it is replacing. Like, oh my God, you cannot imagine something more bloodless to put on the back of a F-150. So, I want to close with, we have...
Can I just comment on that?
You comment on that, and then I want to talk about your book.
The election was partly economic issues, the price of eggs, the inflation of the preceding couple of years, but it was also on post-material issues and cultural issues, which Trump used to his advantage. In particular, the highly effective ad in which Kamala Harris said that the federal government should pay for transition surgery for illegal immigrants. The slogan, she's for they, them, we're for you. These are issues that affect a tiny percentage of the population that are not at all economic, that had an enormous cultural resonance. And so I think which is not to disagree that inflation played a huge role, but I think culture still looms large in people's voting decisions.
I think culture looms large. I agree with that. Your new book, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, is it a book about liberalism?
Not really. Although it touches on a number of issues related to liberalism.
I do think it's about politics. I do think it's about modern politics.
It does have its subtitle is, at least in the United States, is common knowledge. Common knowledge being, in the technical sense, the state in which everyone knows that everyone knows, and everyone knows that, and everyone knows that ad infinitum. So the title actually is When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows ... And I had to fight for the ... My editor said, oh no, you can't end a title with punctuation, it will screw up the indexing services. I found a number of books like David Lodge's novel, Finks ... to fight back on that. But one of my blurbers, Nobel Prize winning mathematician Robert Aumann, said when he got the draft sent out by my editor, which is When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, full stop, he said, that's not technically what common knowledge is. And I brandished that to get my ellipses back.
Well, I want to make sure that we at least put two of the biggest ideas from that book on the table, because they're really interesting, and I think they do intersect with this conversation. Yeah. One is the concept of pluralistic ignorance, and the other is called spirals of silence. So what is pluralistic ignorance? What are spirals of silence?
Yeah, pluralistic ignorance is when it's a kind of common misconception, namely everyone thinks that everyone else thinks something, but no one thinks it. And the classic example, at least in literature, was that if you interview fraternity bros, everyone thinks that it's stupid to drink until you puke and pass out. but they say, what can I do? All the other brothers in the fraternity think it's cool. And it turns out no one thinks it's cool, but everyone thinks that everyone else thinks it's cool. There are a number of examples like that. And spiral of silence is, comes from when there is actual punishment of some belief, where everyone falsifies their preferences and it is afraid to speak out the truth out of fear of being punished, and especially out of fear of not punishing those others who speak the truth. And so you can get kind of madness of crowds and entrenched irrationality when people are punished for pointing out something that is true, sometimes out of fear of being punished if they don't punish themselves.
I think it is a book about liberalism. And my pitch is, your first definition of liberalism, the B in your BLT, was the ability to use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. And it's very hard in a social media mediated world to truly know what the world is thinking, because you have these minority illusions, right? You have this world that you see when you log onto Twitter, or you log onto Instagram, you log onto TikTok. You have a set of norms and values, virtues, that you can see based on that feed and on that scroll in that time. And you can associate from reading that, oh, this is how everybody feels in the entire world. But often it's what some psychologists call a minority illusion. You're just getting this tiny sliver of the world and you're convincing yourself that that's the entire world. And I think it's much, we live in a strange period today where we don't know what the world is thinking, but we think we know what the world is thinking. And we allow that illusion to affect and infect our opinions constantly. And I think that somewhat berserks constitutional democracy in all kinds of ways, because people are often voting on misconceptions of what the world thinks. I love the example from Arlie Russell Hochschild, who's a sociologist who does lots of wonderful work in rural Kentucky and rural Appalachia. I was talking to her about the fact that many people in rural Kentucky, places in rural Kentucky, were the most virulently anti-immigrant. They had the strongest views of anti-immigration. If you look at a color-coded map of immigrant share of each congressional district's population, the parts of America with the fewest immigrants are rural Appalachia. They could use so many more immigrants to help their local economies. These people were not voting or making up their minds based on their lived experience of the world in rural Kentucky. They were watching Fox News. Hochschild told me the largest piece of furniture in their houses was often the television set itself. They were watching Fox News. They were hearing what was happening throughout the rest of the country, and they were inferring an opinion about their own local politics. And I do think that pluralistic ignorance, spirals of silence, the way that we can more easily delude ourselves into thinking certain things by misunderstanding sort of universal opinion, I think is a direct threat to liberal democracy. And I think it's something that your book identifies really, really brilliantly. So last words on that, and then we can open up to questions. So start germinating.
One other example?
Please.
I think that's a great example, but I'll mention one other, which is when people think about the failures of markets, they often think of depressions, crashes, bubbles, bank failures, and so on. The Great Depression being the prime example. And that is these are all examples of common knowledge phenomena. Namely, a bank run occurs when there's a panic in which people think that the bank can't cover its deposits. They don't even have to think that. They might think that other people think that. They may not even think that other people think that. They may think that other people think that other people think that other people think that. But that is sufficient for people to run for the exits to try to withdraw their savings before everyone else does, while their savings left to withdraw. That can occur across an entire economy when you have crashes. Conversely, there are bubbles like the crypto bubble or the tulip bubble several centuries earlier, where an asset rises out of common expectation that I know this is worthless, but other people think it's going to be worth more in the future, so I'll invest now in the hopes of unloading it on a greater fool in the future, which continues until it pops. And a lot of the cynicism about markets is driven by those episodes, such as depressions and recessions and crashes, which are generated by common expectation of common expectation. So it's a problem that was, I don't know if Adam Smith anticipated this. Maybe he did. He seems to have anticipated everything. But it was certainly not until probably the Great Depression that the first solutions to that problem of markets came. In the case of Roosevelt, he actually alluded to common knowledge when he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which was not a feel-good bromide, but an actual diagnosis of what had happened. And federal deposit insurance was one solution to the problem. The Federal Reserve is a lender of last resort. It's still an unsolved problem. There still can be bubbles and crashes, as we saw in 2008. So it's a kind of recurring vulnerability of markets driven by the phenomenon of common knowledge, but sets the markets being a solution to generating affluence, bubbles and crashes and panics being a problem raised by that solution, a problem for which we have some, in turn have some solutions, but not adequate ones yet.
We have time for questions. Do I just call people out? I'm just pointing to them? I'm pointing. All right. Right there, and then somewhere over here, right there.
Jennifer McCoy, Georgia State University. Thank you so much for this. This is great. I want to ask you both, in light of the previous panel, which maybe you weren't here, Derek, I'm not sure.
I caught the end of it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was there.
But your comment that liberalism is seen as bloodless, also referring to the previous panel, there's a lot of post-liberal criticism about lack of not only meaning, but of community, morals, bonding, how do we get this from liberalism? And Stephen, your suggestions of what could give meaning are all big, noble things for other people, mostly. Poverty, world peace and stuff. And I'm wondering how you both think that will this address this post-liberal longing, at least as expressed, and maybe it's, some of the, it was very nihilistic from the last panel, but how can liberalism, if it is bloodless or only has these big noble kind of moral goals, will that address this need for community bonding, closeness?
Would you like to start, or should I jump in?
Why don't you start and then I'll pick it up. I have
with the proviso that I did not see the last panel, and so I can't comment on its nihilism. I think it's interesting that Steve's first answer about defining liberalism mentioned Obama 2 or 3 times. I do kind of see Obama as like the apex predator of modern political liberalism. I think he's profoundly lowercase liberal in his marrow. And when you think about his political success, you think, how much did it really have to do with Millsian liberalism? I'm not sure that an academic liberalism was at its core. What was at its core were other features. An optimism that people found inspiring, a kind of ineffable televisual charisma, and an ability to diagnose the sort of cultural malady of the moment, which was cynicism about the Bush government, and offer the remedy to that, which was an optimism that spanned or exceeded, transcended politics. There are no red states, blue states, United States of America. Hard to imagine in a weird way someone saying that today. And yet in 2004, when he first said it, I think it was at that DNC, it resonated. And so, when I think about political success, I think that people vote for ideas to a certain extent. They also vote for people. So it can sometimes be a little bit of a messy business saying, did a political ideology win this election? Or was it a person who's a bundle of 1,000 different things, their charisma and their moment and their message? On the second point that you made about community, I've written a lot about what I call the antisocial century. Face-to-face socializing has declined 20% this century. the share of people under 24 who say that they attend or host a social gathering on any given day has declined 70% in the last 21 years. I see that crisis as being a technological crisis for the most part, rather than a crisis of ideology or a crisis of illiberalism. I think in many ways we happen to design a lot of technologies that make it very, very convenient to be alone and at home. And I don't say this is a story of liberalism, but I am open to any suggestions that the solution to this problem might draw from the liberal literature.
Yeah, no, I think the decline of community, I mean, part of it, I think I agree, is technologically driven. I mean, I just remember when decades ago, when I didn't have an air conditioner and when there were only 3 networks on TV, there was a lot of motive to get out of the house, to go to public events, to go to other people's houses. Now that I've got a beautiful big OLED TV and air conditioning and so on, it's so much more convenient to stay home. Doesn't hurt me, but I can imagine other people with that temptation could be a lot lonelier. And Derek's article was quite brilliant in pointing that out. But just zooming out a little bit, I mean, this is a problem of especially the last 10, 15 years, I think, or at least exacerbated.
The antisocial century piece?
Yeah.
I mean, what's so amazing about it, sorry, Robert Putnam writes Bowling Alone in 2000, and it creates a debate where people say, either, oh, Putnam's pointing out something that's real, we're having declining social capital, and other people say, no, this is just hogwash, everything's fine. I'm only talking about the last 25 years since Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone. So I think this has been happening since the 1960s, or I don't know, 1890s, the invention of air conditioning, maybe.
Yeah, let me just zoom out. I think it's another example of solutions create problems, because although we like to romanticize traditional close-knit communities and families, many people experience those as highly repressive, that a lot of the 19th century novels, a lot of the rock songs up through the 60s and 70s, Paul Simon and Bruce Springsteen, were all about how oppressive it was to live in a close-knit community, in a rural community in which everyone knew what you were doing, you went into your father's business, you were, if there was a scandal in the family, then it ruined your life by reputation. There were no opportunities. For women in traditional religious societies, such as my wife, she ran screening from her Orthodox close-knit community because it meant that she couldn't write on the Sabbath. She had to spend hours in the kitchen cooking for a big family. She had to spend a month cleaning up the house before Passover. She was very happy to lose that close-knit community. And people now write to her from traditional Muslim communities, Christian communities, about how they too feel trapped, they feel oppressed. So we have now the freedom to live alone, to define our own social circles. That does create the problem that we don't have them there by default. We don't necessarily have a friend or a relative that we can count on if we're suddenly in trouble. It's a problem we haven't yet solved, but it's not an unmitigated disaster. In a sense, the greater freedom that we have was the solution to the problem of the oppressiveness of religion, family, and traditional roles.
That's right.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jennifer Godinez, and I'm with the group Race Forward. And I'm going to say this with a little bit in response that, we have been talking about the far right has a clear white supremacist agenda. Maybe it hasn't been that clear, but I think from what I've heard from the sessions. And clearly, though, that's not going to solve a multiracial democracy, any issues. It's just going to create more problems. ICE, for example, is not really an immigration solution. It's very xenophobic. They're picking up citizens as well. And so I want to know, in terms of a liberalist agenda, how are we really shaping an identity as a multiracial nation? And I'd love to know who's shaping your thinking about race relations as liberals. I actually went back to the text, who I think is a great liberal to always list out as a modern liberal example and humanist, is Martin Luther King. So his text on where do we go from here, chaos or community? And then there's several Latino sociologists, there's others that we really need to bring into this canon. Because again, I think we're solving the issue of how do we become a multiracial nation? I'm not going to become any less Latina as we move forward, right? So that the far right doesn't attack me. But we know we're going to have Muslims in communities, the Appalachian area. We're going to have people who are going to need their economic support. So who's really shaping your thinking on race relations in the liberal agenda?
I would say I'm very much a maximalist when it comes to a booming multi-ethnic democracy in America. When it comes to immigration politics, immigration policy, there's not a lot to be optimistic about right now. And in a way, the degree to which I am optimistic, and I am sort of dispositionally optimistic, Donald Trump is an extraordinary vehicle for turning 52% of the American population against whatever he just decided to do. In many ways, the Biden administration's policies on immigration, which I think went too far on asylum, were a profound and direct reaction to the first Trump administration. And during the Biden administration, you saw that the number of people who were for liberalizing immigration policy declined, and now you see it coming back up. You see it also with free trade, interestingly, with Trump. If you ask Americans right now, and you break them out by ideology, how do you feel about free trade? The people who are most positive about free trade today aren't conservatives or moderate conservatives or centrists or moderate centrists. It's people who identify themselves as, quote, very liberal. And the line over time, the sort of time series, is like, oh, I suddenly decided I'm very free trade. So one way that I'm optimistic about this, and that I begin to think about reconstituting a multi-ethnic liberal coalition, the Democratic Party, is to observe that Donald Trump, despite somehow winning popularity contests, is paradoxically fantastically unpopular. And whatever he does policy-wise tends to generate a really profound backlash that the opposition can use if it's sensible to use it in a way that can build sustainable momentum behind it. I think the Biden administration went too far in that regard, but I do think that there's absolutely a path forward on immigration policy that can liberalize immigration policy in the next administration and administrations after that. It's probably not going to come from allowing unprecedented numbers of people to pass over the border in a way that creates a headline for Fox News to run day after day after day after day after day. I think what you probably want is a quieter liberalization of immigration policy that coincides with more security at the border to make sure that there are no headlines of that kind.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll add a couple of things. You know, the problem of immigration has been, or the issue of immigration has been conflated with the issue of illegal immigration. And I watched a debate with Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke, and the question of immigration came up, and Cruz, who I despise, said, my position is simple: legal, good; illegal, bad. Now, that's kind of a hard thing to disagree with, and a huge mistake of liberalism would be to be on the side of lawlessness, as it unfortunately has been a number of times, such as in the slogan, defund the police, abolish the police. That's just a losing proposition, just not only on basis of principle, because rule of law ought to be a foundational principle of liberalism, but because, especially when it comes to policing, people really don't like living in a dangerous neighborhood, and they will vote for whoever will promise to reduce crime. That's a bit of a digression from a multiracial society. I think that is very much worth aspiring to, and again, it is by no means romantic or idealistic. There's research from social evolutionary psychology done by Lita Cosmides and the late John Tooby that actually race is very superficial in people's perception. What people are sensitive to is coalitions of tribes, of factions that appear to be in competition. Whether they have the same skin color or not, people often forget, easily forget. What often happens is that sometimes you've got coalitions that tend to correlate with race, and then race becomes more salient. But as long as people think we're all Americans, then they can very easily overlook the difference between black, white, Hispanic. And it's been one of the tragedies, I think, of leftism to elevate identity, to make it as salient as possible in countless policies, not just racial preferences, but in training sessions, and to just make people constantly paying attention to the race of everyone else that might push in the wrong direction. But in an earlier period of mass immigration, the first decades of the 20th century, there were similar fears that how can we have a society that's going to have Jews and Italians and Poles and Germans and Irish, they're all going to hate each other's guts. And in fact, in those decades, they did, exactly. But there was also an ethic of the melting pot, and now the idea that the Irish neighborhood would be at war with the German neighborhood or the Polish neighborhood, it seems rather quaint. We've kind of moved beyond that. I think there's no reason we can't move beyond that in the case of African American, European American, Latino, and so on.
Last question, this young man in the front row.
Thanks. My name is Sergey Lopatin. I am for breakout room 1 and high schooler who reads way too much Substack, but
No such thing.
I'm also don't read too much David Hume or Popper, so I'm sorry. I hope you can lay this one off, but you laid out some very good and very clear guidelines on liberalism. And I'm just wondering if now, especially since Republicans are mainly in power, do you have any sort of changes to the original concept of liberalism? Because I remember in like mid 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, there was a change in liberalism because in several moments they were losing elections and they needed to change their way of thinking. And then because of that, they started to win. So do you think that there are any changes to liberalism that need to be made to change the Democratic Party and have it winning? And what do you think those are?
Yeah, I think that it's a very good question. And, liberals or anyone has to be prepared to learn, to be empiricists, to find out what isn't working, including how to win elections, but also what is leading to a better life for citizens, what's making people better off or worse off. And so here I think that Derek's work on abundance is relevant, that a number of policy changes that had noble goals when they were implemented, as they started to accumulate, worked against people's well-being in making housing unaffordable and other unforeseen consequences. And so it's time to kind of recalibrate and say, well, we've gone too far in protecting neighborhood character and the environment and hiring and so on. So that would be one kind of redirection. I think that successful Democratic politicians like Bill Clinton recognize that people don't like feeling unsafe in their neighborhoods, and that reducing crime, often branded as a Republican and right-wing issue, should be assimilated by the left. In the case of Clinton, we saw the greatest reduction in violent crime probably in American history in a liberal president who took the problem of crime seriously. In every decade, there'll be different problems, and maybe a completely open border, certainly climate change going forward, although it's an uphill, the solutions can't be ones that force lower middle class people to pay more for home heating oil and for gasoline. So the problem of how to address climate change without putting the burden on vast numbers of voters is a problem that liberals have to take seriously. So I think that there's no one answer. The meta answer is be open to unforeseen problems, to new problems, to side effects, and constantly be updating with new solutions to the problems created by the old solutions.
I was hoping when I called on you that you would get Steve to plug my book. So thank you for that really brilliantly articulated question. Please join me in thanking Steve Pica.
Thank you.